All right, greetings, followers. I am honored to be joined by Casey Yost and also Carly Regan. They are both from the Penn State Extension office, and they both have different specialties. And we're going to reference the summer outlook as well here with the Hagerstown Town and Country Almanac. So Casey Yost, dairy educator, her expertise is in calf and heifer management. So we are happy to have her back for this podcast, looking ahead to the spring and summer season. And Carly is a horticultural educator, and her specialization is vegetables and small fruit. So thank you very much for joining us today, Casey and Carly. We really appreciate having you on. So I'll first start out with Casey, and Casey is going to talk a little bit about the wild swings we've had in temperatures and what dairy farmers should pay particular attention to as we go in through the spring and summer seasons.
Thank you, Chad. Happy to be here again, collaborating with the Hagerstown Almanac. So if you have any questions, this is my contact information, and feel free to reach out to me. So one of the things we are going to look at today is the crazy temperature swings that we are having lately. Typically, we do see some temperature swings in the spring and fall especially, but what are some of those things that we can do to keep our animals comfortable, and what areas should we manage a little more closely when we do see those temperature swings? So the first issue that I talk about is bedding. As you can see, there are many different options that we can use as far as bedding. There's sawdust, farmers will use corn fodder, can also use straw and other types of material. But one thing that we have to keep in mind is just keeping that nice and deep for those calves, as well as dry at all times. With this temperature swings, the days like today might be really warm, but we can dip down into some frigid temperatures in the evening. And if that bedding is wet and that's just not a comfortable environment for those calves to nestle into, then when those temperatures do dip down into the colder temperatures in the evening. Chad, I don't know if you can give any more perspective on those temperature swings, and are these normal? Are we seeing more than average this year?
Well, we have seen some wild temperature swings this year, and traditionally the month of April has the biggest temperature swings when we look at the historical data. I pulled up some information from Harrisburg, and the top 10 days where the temperature actually differed the most, in other words, the largest temperature swings, occurred during the month of April and May. So this is the prime time. And we have seen, when we look at the distribution curve of temperatures over this past spring, we see kind of two areas where temperatures have been relatively above normal and below normal, which indicates that this spring we have seen temperatures a little bit more extreme than previous years.
On the next slide, you can see some other information pertaining to bedding. One thing that we can do is, if we're not sure if our bedding needs to be updated, is our bedding too wet or too dry? Not too dry, but we can do a simple test called a knee test, where you just simply go into the pen and drop down on your knees. And a good rule of thumb is, if there's any moisture on your knees after that, then it's time to rebed that pen. We like that level to be nice and adequate. 6 inches is a good rule of thumb, so just keeping that bedding dry and moisture-free is a good rule of thumb. If you advance those couple slides, they just might be out of order, but we also can go by nesting scores. There should be one more picture on there. If you look at the top one, that's a nesting score of 1. If you would advance it 3 more times there, Chad. That's good. So a nesting score of 1, we can say that all the legs are entirely visible. 2, the legs are partially visible when they're lying down. And 3, that calf is able to nestle nicely into that bedding material. So when we talk about bedding, there's some rules of thumb we can follow. Like I said, this knee test is a real accurate, easy test to do. And then we can look at the nesting score, and that again is just that ability for those animals to nestle into that dry bedding. So in addition to bedding, farmers also utilize calf jackets on their particularly young animals. So you can see the little Jersey on the left, her her jacket's nice and loose and it fits her nicely. Whereas I put this picture on the right here because that jacket is actually way too tight for that calf. And it can actually dig into their backs of their legs. You can see how those straps are pretty taut there. So just as the weather swings and the temperature swings occur, we just have to manage those jackets a little bit better, especially taking those jackets off in the daytime because those calves can sweat under those jackets. And if the temperatures do dip down into the uncomfortable ranges in the evenings, then that kind of negates the use of that jacket as she's a little wet under there and not able to keep her warm like we'd like it to be. So just something to think about if we're still using jackets into the spring or even when the fall comes around, just be mindful of those differences between night temperatures and daytime temperatures and just manage those jackets a little better.
And one thing to indicate is the temperatures during a sunny day will typically rise the fastest between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. That's when we get the most heating during the day. So that's when temperatures warm pretty rapidly, and they would notice the temperature change as well.
Another area we can focus on is just ventilation for the pens. So this example on the left here, I like it because there's multiple sources of ventilation for this building. There's a fan, there's a positive pressure tube system, there's also curtains that are actually on a temperature control, and then there's also some garage doors. So plenty of options to keep that building in particular ventilated, but just to think about the systems that you have, whether they're manually put up and down or, the fans, they can be put on thermostats as well. A lot of the buildings that are using these adjustable curtains, they're on thermostats that you can set. So when the temperatures do get pretty high during the day, that we can control them. Well, they're being controlled for us since we don't have to go out there, especially if the farmer's away for the day or something like that. The picture on the right, it's a little bit more of a manual setup, but we do have other options to kind of keep drafts and things like that off of our particularly young animals. There has to be a pretty cold temperatures to be able to, need to use these hover systems that you see over top of that calf, but just be mindful of keeping those barns open, closed, especially when those winds are coming at you from different levels. I don't know if you have anything to add on that, Chad, as far as, where those winds particularly come from, or, the thing with our dividers and our curtains, we wanted to keep those drafts off of those young animals and just provide proper ventilation for the older animals as they're going to start to produce a little more body heat with their rumens functioning and producing extra body heat.
Yeah, our strongest winds typically come out of the west-northwest, and the windiest period in the springtime is usually April into early May when we get those big fluctuations in temperatures. Once we get into the summer season, most of our winds occur, the strongest winds or the longest duration of winds will occur during thunderstorms and also during tropical storms and hurricanes if we should have one. But typically during the day, the wind's not as strong in June, July, and August as it is during the spring season. So by the time we get to the middle of May, that's when these temperature differences along fronts become a little bit less and the wind magnitude isn't as strong.
Another thing to be mindful of, a lot of farmers will utilize grazing systems or exercise lots for their heifers and other young stock, even your dairy cattle. But the thing to really be mindful of, especially in the summer months, is making sure there's shade available, whether that's from a building or that's from a tree line, just making sure that those animals are able to get out of that direct sunlight. Something as simple as the little lean-to that's on the bottom right there. You can see that they're definitely utilizing that shade, but just providing shade for those animals. We have to think about them being in a thick leather jacket. So we want to provide places to keep them cool, especially if they don't have access to a barn during the daytime hours.
And we'll talk a little bit more about when I expect the sunniest periods during the summer outlook here coming up in a couple of minutes.
Lastly, I just wanted to mention something about water. As you know, water is extremely important to animals of all ages. The bottom right-hand picture is actually a setup that is on a heavily grazing operation. So you can kind of see that line floating into that water tub and then that float on the top there. So that is directly hooked up to a water source. So even out on pasture, that water source for those animals is going to continuously stay filled up. So that's important to make sure that that's available to them, especially if they're outdoors. I just have two pictures of the other kind of a drinker there. The top left drinker is actually frozen solid. So that was in a pen that we were in with some young stock, and they weren't drinking enough out of that water container to keep it from freezing. So we just want to make sure everything's working properly. We're not so much in the dead of winter anymore that these kind of drinkers are going to freeze up, but we do want to be mindful of that and just to monitor them, keep them nice and clean like the picture on top, and just making sure that water is available to all age groups.
And what about the temperature of the water as the sun heats? I know the water doesn't warm as fast as the land surface, but does the temperature of the water impact their health at all?
No, not so much. There's some studies that people have looked at. Do I offer my calves on milk warm water or cold water? So different things like that, but not so much that anything affects the health. I would think that the cooler water would help to cool them down a little bit more in the summer months, just when you think of when they do consume that water. You think about a calf drinking warm milk in the wintertime. If that milk is not at a temperature that it needs to be, then that calf is going to expend energy to warm that back up to her body temperature. So if you think about it, you would think that cooler water would definitely help to get that cow or young stock kind of pulled down a little quicker than, say, like a tub that's sitting there in the direct sunlight that they're actually drinking some warmer water. But just to make sure it's offered to them and available is what we really want in the summer months.
Okay. All right. That was great information, Casey. Thank you very much. And now we have Dr. Regan with us, and she joined the Extension office just about 6 months ago or so. And can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. So yeah, I'm excited to be in this new position in Franklin County. As Chad just mentioned, I started in September, so I'm heading into my first growing season in this role and definitely learning a lot from the growers I've been working with so far. Prior to this, I had been working in vegetable entomology research at Cornell, and then had also done my PhD in entomology at Penn State. So I'm excited to be back in Pennsylvania and working in our state's agricultural systems. My responsibilities here in Franklin County cover commercial horticulture, which ranges from vegetables to small fruit, and then a little bit of sort of flowers and greenhouse production as well.
Excellent. And there's her information there on the screen. And I guess you want to talk a little bit about the weather swings and frost damage, because we're not completely out of the frost season just yet.
Yes, this is very true. And so as Casey was just mentioning, we are seeing quite a bit of swings here in the spring. And so on a day like today where it's so warm, it can be easy to start getting excited about planting things. Or, for example, some of our crops that are perennials like tree fruit or strawberries, those plants start responding to the warmth and sunlight that we're having and start getting ready to bloom and produce fruit on those crops. And so when we then have frost after that, we can risk having damage to our crops. And so the photo on the left here is showing some frost damage on leaves of a cauliflower plant. And then the photo on the right is actually one I took recently during the cherry blossom bloom in DC. But we saw bloom a little bit earlier than we typically would for that, maybe a week or two earlier than what the average is for DC. And then sure enough had a cold snap right after that. And so I know there was some decreased bloom quality after we had had that colder weather. And so for tree fruit growers, if they're apple trees, or especially for peach and apricot trees that are much more sensitive to frost damage, if they start getting ready to bloom because we're having warmer weather earlier in the spring, and then we have frost damage, that can really impact yield of some of those fruiting trees. And so for some crops, particularly vegetables and things like strawberries, this won't work quite so well if you're growing tree fruit, but for some of those lower to the ground plants that we're planting, if you have a small enough acreage, row covers can be a good strategy for you. So ideally, you would wait until we're late enough into spring that it's safe to plant a crop without suffering frost damage, but it can be really tempting to try to get things in earlier to sort of capture that extra sunlight and warmth we're having and really give those crops a head start. And so being able to come in and cover if we're just going to have a night or two of cold later in the spring can be one strategy to help save you from damage to those crops. And then for some crops, particularly this is relevant to strawberries, but on a smaller scale, we can sometimes rely on straw mulch placed over vegetables or low to the ground fruit to provide them some protection. And these pictures are sort of showing a pretty common example of what we do for strawberries, where these are overwintering. We plant them in early fall, overwinter them, and then are harvesting berries June, July, sometimes later in the summer. And so we typically overwinter them, protecting them from frost damage throughout the winter by covering them with a straw mulch. And then a few weeks ago or so, usually mid-March to mid-April throughout Pennsylvania is when we start taking that mulch off for the season so that those plants can grow. And so oftentimes, if we're thinking about weather swings, we advise strawberry growers to not remove the mulch all the way, start raking it, but leave it in those row middles so that if you need to, you can put it back on for a night or two to keep those blooming plants from having damage, because we start to see some pretty serious damage to flowers really as soon as we get below freezing temperatures.
It appears that they probably wouldn't be susceptible to blowing around in the wind, too. The straw mulch seems like it would probably stay intact even on our windy days. Is that correct?
Typically, we are putting a deep enough layer so that it doesn't blow away. So that's good, especially for folks planting directly into the ground. If folks are putting straw mulch over strawberries that have been planted into a plastic mulch bed, sometimes that's a little bit more vulnerable because the mulch is a little bit slippery. So typically, they just pile it on a little bit deeper to keep it weighted down and make sure it doesn't completely blow away in the wind.
Okay.
And then Chad can share some more information on this, but we are seeing a little bit of dry conditions heading into this spring in some areas, particularly Southeast PA, seeing a little bit below average precipitation so far this year. And so a big thing to be watching out for as a grower is to make sure your irrigation equipment is ready to go this year. So a lot of times we're heading into planting and we're getting busy, and maybe we aren't worrying about irrigation first thing when we're planting. It's really, later in the summer, especially the heat of July or so, that we are irrigating on a pretty regular schedule. And so sometimes for some crops, we get them planted and then we come back and finish setting up that irrigation equipment later. But I think this year that could be risky. So if you have the ability, make sure you're really taking a look at your equipment, checking for leaks, and getting yourself ready to have it hooked up sooner rather than later, so that if you do need to start irrigating shortly after planting, you'll be ready to do that and make sure you can carry your crops into the growing season.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about the dryness that we're seeing right now in the forecast for the spring and summer here in a couple of minutes.
And then, so we've talked about sort of crops that are already in the ground and getting ready to plant, but another thing to keep an eye out is that, especially with some of the weather swings we're having, is to make sure we don't plant things too early. So there are a number of vegetable crops that can tolerate light frosts, or even there are some that can tolerate heavier frosts. So make sure that those are what you're planting early. Don't get tempted to plant things too soon, because if you end up losing your crop to frost, it won't have been worth it to give those crops a head start. So this photo here is showing onions. A lot of our alliums do fine if we have a little bit of a light frost. And so many growers in the south central, southeast part of PA have planted them up to a month ago at this point. There are a few growers that are still sort of waiting to get them in the ground, but they're getting going. And then on the next slide is a reminder that if you're trying to decide what to grow, make sure you know what your plant hardiness zone is for your area. So especially here in PA, we have a pretty wide range where we're going from sort of the late 4B growing zones all the way down into 7 down in the southeast part of the season. So we cover a pretty wide range of plant hardiness as we move through the state, and particularly in certain areas where we have some of our valleys, we end up having pretty different growing zones, even just not a very big distance away. And so make sure you know where you're located, what the hardiness zone is for where you are, and when the typical timing for planting is for that zone, so that you have a sense of when it's safe to get crops in the ground. So knowing our hardiness zone helps know what we can start to get in the ground a little bit earlier in the spring, but there are certainly crops where we really don't want to get ahead of ourselves, and definitely best to wait until we're past the predicted frost-free date for this year, and wait until it's really sort of later into the late spring, early summer for many of our crops like peppers, tomatoes, especially peppers. Peppers are particularly sensitive. So just sort of having a sense of what crops to plant earlier, what crops to plant later, and then when we typically reach those timings for our growing zone can be helpful, so we make careful planting decisions, and then that can carry into the growing season by setting those crops up for successful establishment.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. That's some great information. And now we're going to talk about the spring and summer outlook, and I have some information as well concerning the last spring freeze across the regions. And that's a good segue into our outlook for the rest of the spring into the early part of the fall, the 2022 Hagerstown Town and Country Almanack forecast. So the spring blooms arrive 10 to 15 days earlier than average. Now, Carly, you touched on this with the blossoms in Washington, D.C. that came out about a week ahead of time. And we saw the first spring blooms across the entire Mid-Atlantic about 10 to 15 days earlier than average. The soil moisture anomaly, this is 8 inches deep into the soil. So we're doing pretty good with that. We're in the upper percentile. But you mentioned that the abnormally dry areas in south central Pennsylvania have developed this year. And this graphic right here shows the precipitation anomalies. This is the departure from the 1981 to 2021 average. So we are behind about 1 to 3 inches below average across southern Pennsylvania, and even a stripe of moderate drought here in the Philadelphia area. Moderate drought indicates potential damage to some crops and also low stream flow, which is more pertains to this time of the year because the crops aren't out just yet. But notice the fine line here. Once you get north of the Pennsylvania Turnpike, precipitation is above average. So we are doing pretty good across central and northern Pennsylvania. Looking ahead into the rest of April into May, this is a look at the temperature and precipitation trends over the last 10 years. And rainfall has trended near to slightly above average across much of the Mid-Atlantic, and temperatures have trended above average as well. That's the look at the last 10 years. I think the key factors going forward is a look at the lower stratospheric polar vortex. So it's a large area where you have a low pressure in the stratosphere, and it always breaks down once we get into the springtime. But the average date, for the median date in which it breaks down, is typically between the 12th and the 15th of April. Well, this year, the upper part of the stratospheric polar vortex, actually, the winds reversed from a westerly direction to an easterly direction, and that reversal of winds triggers the warming event. That happened around March 20th. And the lower part of the stratospheric polar vortex reversed direction April 10th. So each of these episodes tends to lead to a cold snap that moves across the northern hemisphere. So when we look at past years in which the final stratospheric warming event has occurred earlier than the median date, we see that temperatures are slightly below average and rainfall is near average across Pennsylvania. There is a little stripe in south central Pennsylvania where it's slightly below average. That's one factor going forward into the spring season, the rest of the spring season. The median date, when we look at the data set, it's the kind of the middle ground here of when we expect the last spring freeze. And south central Pennsylvania is April 11th, but it's not until the early part of May here across northern Pennsylvania is when we typically get that last morning where temperatures are well below freezing and can impact, like you said, the growing season. So I think that this particular image is a good precursor to what will happen or what will transpire as we go forward to the rest of the spring season. We're also looking at La Nina. We've been in a La Nina pattern ever since the fall season of last year, and that continues through the springtime, but we are going to transition into a neutral pattern. Most of the forecast model guidance indicates we will be in the neutral pattern, which means the sea surface temperature anomalies in the equatorial Pacific will be near average going forward June through September. So when we look at the most recent spring La Nina to neutral summer outcomes, so we're looking at the June through September timeframe now, so we're fast forwarding ahead to the summertime. Rainfall tends to be above average by a good bit across much of the mid-Atlantic. There's a strong signal for a wet summer across the mid-Atlantic, and temperatures tend to be near average when we make that transition from a spring La Nina to a neutral summer. Now, when we look at the last 10 years, we looked at the last 10 years with respect to the springtime. This is rainfall trends over the last 10 years have been above average across the mid-Atlantic. Now, we have many different local climatologies in the mid-Atlantic. We have the rain shadow effect east of the Alleghenies, which means that some areas downwind of the plateau may be a little bit drier than some other areas closer to Interstate 81 or the Blue Ridge. So this particular graphic doesn't take into account all those mesoscale features with the different climatologies that we have across the mid-Atlantic. But the general overview is above average rainfall and temperatures that are above average when compared to the last 30 years. When we look at the month that is likely to see downside in rainfall potential, in other words, less rain than average, that would be the month of September across the mid-Atlantic. So that might be one of the drier months going forward through September. The months most likely to see upside temperature potential would be July and also in September. So those would be the key months in which you would definitely want, calves and heifers to have plenty of water, a water resource available. And then especially once we get into September, it does appear that there will be some dry spells in September and lots of sunshine, so they will definitely need the shade. Another striking trend is low temperatures, and this is showing kind of a bell curve. If we look at the last 30 years and then compare it to the most recent 5 years. So this shows low temperatures from June, July, and August in the Chambersburg area. And the bell curve shows that low temperatures historically fall within that 65 to 67 degrees Fahrenheit. But in the last 5 years, notice we've had a little bit of a shift to the right or the warmer side of this curve. And you can see that with this data in the upper right. Might be a little bit difficult to see, but the most of the population in the low temperatures have actually risen from 62.6 to 63.49. And when you look at that, that's a pretty big difference over the last 5 years. So we are seeing temperatures at night not falling as much as they have in the past. We are seeing warmer overnight lows. When we look at the daytime high temperatures, though, there is a shift towards a slight warmer high temperatures during the afternoon. You can see that the bell curve here with the 30-year mean is closer to about 84, and then the shift is a little bit more to the right. But we are seeing a striking trend more in the low temperatures being a little bit warmer because of the mugginess that we see in the air than the high temperatures being warmer when we look at the past 5 years. So we are still obviously going to see very warm days. This is just a distribution of averages. So here's a couple key highlights that we see going forward through the spring and the summer. The final spring freeze, that's when temperatures will likely be below 32, and in some cases a hard frost, as you mentioned, Carly, that can damage crops, which will be in the upper 20s to near 30 degrees. We anticipate that will be around April 19th in southern Pennsylvania to April 30th farther north in Pennsylvania. But we do expect a light frost right around May 20th in the northern part of Pennsylvania, but this won't be a sustainable frost over a consecutive period of days. It'll be more of an anomaly, so to speak, in the temperature pattern in the middle of May. So it's not going to be a sustainable cold period. We do expect the heat indices to get over 100, especially in southeastern Pennsylvania, during like a 1 to 2 day time period between the 18th of June and the 25th, the middle of July, and then again in the middle of August. So that's some important information, especially in keeping those calves and heifers with plenty of water during those periods. And typically the hottest days in the summer, right around July 20th, is typically when we have our warmest temperatures. But we also see a spike in August sometimes. Usually during the first 11 or 12 days, we can have temperatures near 100 degrees on occasion. The driest stretches of summer will likely be the 4th through the 13th of June, the 1st through the 13th of July, a period there in August between the 13th and 19th, and September between the 1st and 9th. Now, overall, we do expect above average rainfall in the summer, but these periods I mentioned here would have the least amount of rain. Most of the rain that we get in the mid-Atlantic comes from thunderstorms in the summer, which can drop 1 to 2 inches of rain in a period of a couple of hours. So you can almost satisfy 1/4 of your average rainfall from one daytime thunderstorm or a complex of thunderstorms on one summer day. So we are not expecting a drought to develop in Pennsylvania. As a matter of fact, we expect the drought that's in the Philadelphia area, that moderate drought, will likely be erased this summer. But these are the periods when you have to pay a particular concern to the dry irrigation, like you were talking about, Carly, and have things ready for that, because there will be periods where we will have dry weather, but we're not going to dig into a drought, and we will erase the drought that is across the southeastern parts of Pennsylvania. We do expect, though, that May through July will yield above average rainfall, but then we'll transition to a drier pattern at towards the end of the growing season from August to September. So that's our outlook going forward through September. From the Hagerstown Town and Country Almanac, and of course our website here, almanac.com. There's a lot of good information there. So I'll turn the table over to any of you if you have any questions for me with respect to the summer outlook.
We had mentioned a little bit about humidity levels. Will that be kind of normal this year? Do you anticipate some higher than normal days being these hot, humid days? And then again, you also mentioned about our evenings not being able to kind of cool down as much, and that particularly affects dairy cows because they need that time to cool down during the evening stretches to bring their body temperatures back down to a maintainable level. So when we see periods where they're not able to cool themselves down, where it stays warm both day and night, that becomes a pretty big time for farmers to try to get their cows cooled down and provide them some relief.
Yes, I do think that because of the high moisture content in the air, that our low temperatures will follow this bell curve that we see here and follow the 5-year trend. So we'll have some pretty muggy nights, and we will have high humidity. And I think the highest humidities will occur during these warm stretches in June, July, and August. So I do expect the humidity levels will be comparable, if not a little bit higher than they were last year during the summer. So that'll be a big concern, I think, here across the mid-Atlantic, and that'll contribute to our warmer overnight low temperatures as well. Not saying the entire summer is going to be like that. We will have occasional cold fronts come through, but I think overall we'll have a warmer summer, and especially a more humid summer than we did last year.
I'm sure many of the vegetable growers in the state are going to have to keep an extra eye out scouting for plant diseases in that case, because so many of them thrive when it's warm and humid. There are some that are more prone during cooler, moister conditions, but there are some that are, I'm sure, going to take advantage of that higher humidity.
And I think that especially along the I-95 corridor is where there will be some bullseyes of higher than average rainfall compared to the rest of the state as well. I think some of the highest amounts of rain will be over in that southeast corner of Pennsylvania, which is a climatologically favorite area for thunderstorms to produce some heavy rain. So I think when we look ahead at the month months of June, July, and August, that'll be one of the key areas that will have some higher moisture content as well. All right, well, let me start sharing here. All right. So I think we had some good discussion here, and I think both of you for all of your information. I think it's very informative. I think our followers will find out, again, a lot of insight from this as well. So I thank you so much for joining me today, and hopefully the information I provided will be an asset to both of you as well, going forward through the summer months. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Chad.
Thank you.
Absolutely.